Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Leslie, please raise your thumb if you can. All right, great. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the latest in the webinar series, Naturally Arkansas, sponsored by the Central Arkansas Library System. I'm your host, Lynn Foster, and this is the last Naturally Arkansas webinar of 2022. It will be recorded and posted on the CAL's YouTube channel, as all previous webinars in our series have been. If you are watching them for the first time, I encourage you to go take a look. There's been one every month since January. And even if you've seen some before, you may be like me and you want to go back and go a little slower and take some notes as to what you've seen. For information about our programming next year, just stay tuned. If you have suggestions, I encourage you to message me on Facebook. I'm the Lynn Foster, who is a box turtle, so I'm easy to spot. Tonight's guest is Leslie Cooper. If you saw last month's webinar, you will recognize her as she told us about monarch butterflies and how to support them in our gardens. Tonight, she will be talking about gardening for native bees, and we are so happy to have her back. Thank you, Leslie. Leslie is the Monarch and Pollinator Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, and she's also the coordinator of the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership. Please post any questions you have in chat. I will be monitoring chat during Leslie's presentation. And Leslie, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to join me for this presentation. As Lynn introduced me, I'm going to be talking about gardening for bees today. If I can get my slide to advance. There we go. So first, we're going to open up and we're going to meet the pollinators. So there's 6 main groups of invertebrate pollinators. There's butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. And of these, bees are the only pollinators that consume pollen as nectar, pollen and nectar as larvae and adults. And bees, because of this makes bees the most preeminent pollinators across the landscape because they're the only ones that are intentionally moving pollen throughout the landscape. And that's a quote from Rich Hatfield with the Xerces Society. He's an actual pollinator researcher. And if you don't take my word for it, take his. So the problem is that pollinators are in decline, and like over 16% of our vertebrate pollinators, so our bats and our hummingbirds and whatnot, are threatened with extinction globally, and more than 40% of our invertebrate pollinators may be facing extinction, particularly our bees and butterflies. So bees are in the insect order Hemenoptera, and this is the insect order that includes bees, wasps, ants, and sawflies. And there's 7 families of bees worldwide. There's 6 in North America. The 7th is only found in Australia. I'm not even going to attempt to say those family names out loud, but if you're tuning into this webinar to learn more about these fascinating bees and the diversity that they have, this is not the webinar for you. I highly recommend looking at Identifying Native Bees with Olivia Carroll. It's a great recorded webinar that's from Ohio State. It covers the key characteristics from these genera, and she is a native bee expert and co-author of Bees in Your Backyard, which is one of my favorite books to recommend. You just search it on YouTube by the title, and it was uploaded in 2018. We also have a recorded webinar on our own YouTube channel, which is the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership YouTube channel. We had Coleman Little from the University of Central Arkansas. He is my native bee expert in the state, and he covers a diversity, like the diversity of bees in Arkansas, their different social structures, nesting habits, and different taxonomic groups. There's also a 2019 webinar from the Natural Areas Association that talks about the role of honeybees in natural areas. It covers pollinator decline, natural areas, and the pollinator interactions. And if you don't want to look up a recording, there's an upcoming webinar series from Ohio State every Friday from October 14th through November 11th. They are covering all kinds of different topics. So first things first, I want to talk about European honeybees. So sometimes people are all the time. People are surprised that I say that our beloved honeybees are actually not native to North America. They're all European honeybees. Apis mellifera is the species. And honeybees are important pollinators to agriculture. They are managed pollinators, but they can also forage on native plants. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see a honeybee foraging on a native mint species. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a honeybee on one of our beloved milkweed plants. It's butterfly milkweed. And really, the only reason why I bring this up is because I'm sure that a lot of you have heard save the bees. Well, how many of you automatically think of honeybees when we think of save the bees? So they've really become the kind of face for the plight of the pollinators. So I just want to be very clear. I'm not a honeybee hater. I love honeybees just as much, but there's many other people in the state that can talk to you about honeybees, and not very many people that talk or shed some light on some of our native bees. So now that that's out of the way, we're going to cover native bees tonight. So first, before we start talking about bees, we have to talk about generalists and specialists. So there won't be a quiz at the end, but generalist pollinators, you can think of them as they're not very picky eaters. Think of these as the honeybees and the bumblebees. They nectar and collect pollen from a variety of different species. They're really general in what they're deciding to nectar and collect pollen from. Specialist pollinators, on the other hand, specialize on either a certain plant or members of the same family. So there's a lot of like aster specialists, and the photo on the right is actually one of our native squash bees. So some specialists are only, you can only see them during a few weeks out of the year because they emerge when that native plant that they specialize on is in bloom, and other times of the year they're dormant. So native bees, there are approximately 4,000 species of native bees in North America, and our native bees have special habitat requirements. They require foraging habitat, something to eat, nesting habitat, somewhere to raise their young, and overwintering habitat. And that one's kind of self-explanatory. So of the native bees that we have in Arkansas, this collection represents approximately 200 species. So you can really see the diversity in sizes and colors. And Arkansas likely has between 400 and 650 species of bees. It's 2022, and it blows my mind that we don't have a full inventory on what native bee species we have in the state. But we're working on it, and I'll get to that later. So quickly, what is a bee? So this is the anatomy of a bumblebee because they're large and it's easy to see. So bees have 2 pairs of wings, 6 legs, 5 eyes. They have 2 compound eyes, the large eyes that we see, and 3 simple eyes that are kind of found on the top of their forehead, if you will. And they also have pollen collecting structures. So these could be corbicula, scopa, or even internal pollen collection. And some of them actually consume the pollen and transport it that way. Those bees are kind of special and they're not very hairy. So this is a photo that I'm going to show. You can never unsee it. These, the circle just indicates where their simple eyes, their ocelli, are on top of their heads. And we talked about those pollen collecting structures. So corbicula versus scopa. I have another photo that shows it a little bit better, but the scopa are feathered hairs that are on bees' bodies that they use to collect pollen. And corbicula are the same things that honeybees have, and they're kind of these flat spots on their hind legs where they pack these pollen. Sometimes it's called a pollen basket. So only females have these pollen collecting structures because they're the ones that provision the nests, and male bees and cuckoo bees don't have these pollen collecting structures. Males don't need them because they're not provisioning the nests, and cuckoo bees, like the cowbird, the brown cowbird, are actually called kleptoparasites. So they actually lay their eggs in the nests of other bees, which is really cool. So this is a better picture that kind of shows the difference between corbicula and scopa. Corbicula is on the bumblebee that's on the right, and then on the left, that's a long hornbee that has really fuzzy legs, if you will. And some of our native bees actually have scopa on their abdomens. Those are the leaf cutter bees, and they're some of my favorites. So how do I identify a bee? I get a lot of questions on, is it a bee, is it a fly, is it a wasp? But the bees and the flies are the easiest to identify, distinguish between the two. So bees actually have longer antennae, flies have short antennae. Bees have 4 wings, and flies are in the insect order Dioptera, which means 2 wings. And bees have those pollen collecting hairs, and flies have large eyes that almost touch the top. So of these photos on the right, would you care to take a guess? You don't have to type it in the chat or anything, but in your brain, look at all 6 of those photos and pick which ones you think are bees. Those are the only 2 bees pictured on this slide. There's the leafcutter bee on the bottom, and there's a bumblebee up top, and all the rest of these insects are flies. You can tell because you can see the tiny little antennae that are sticking up, and it's hard to distinguish, but you can actually see the 4 wings on the bee. See the little line right there. And then flies, I've blown the pictures up so you can see a little bit better. The flies have those really distinguishing eyes that almost touch at the top, and then the very short antenna that kind of V out. So bees also have special senses. They can detect floral electric fields, and this helps them determine, if a flower has been recently visited, and it can help them discriminate between different flower shapes. The photo on the right kind of shows that. And they can also see ultraviolet light. So bees see flowers differently than we do. And this guides them to where the good stuff is, where the nectar and pollen are. So that's kind of interesting. So we've talked about generalists and specialists, but we also need to talk about solitary versus social bees. So more than 90% of our native bees are solitary. And this just means that each female constructs and provisions her nest without any help from members of her species. So she is just hardworking on her own. And because of this, they're less aggressive than honeybees because they don't have that hive to defend. They're very, very busy, and they are too busy collecting nectar and pollen so that they can raise their young. So they're really not super defensive. And bumblebees are the best known native social bees that we have. There's also 200 plus species of sweat bees that sometimes nest socially, but I could have an entire presentation dedicated on the nesting habits of our native bees, so we won't get into that today. So bumblebees, some of my favorites, the giant fuzzy flying cows of the sky. There's actually 51 bombus species in North America, and they're considered cavity nesters. So they nest in tree cavities, under tussocks of grass, like the photo on the right. And most of the time they actually use abandoned rodents' nests. And bumblebees are special because they're capable of something called buzz pollination or sonication. And this just means that they are able to vibrate at a certain frequency to extract pollen from anthers. Certain flowers have anthers, and anthers are the parts of the flower that produce pollen. And the pollen is inside of these anthers. So you can think of them like a salt shaker. So the bees actually vibrate to shake that salt shaker and extract the pollen from that part of the flower. Crops like blueberries, tomatoes, potatoes, chili peppers, and eggplants have this type of anther on their flower. So of the flight seasons of the bumblebee, their life cycles are very unique, especially considering most people are most familiar with European honeybees. Unlike European honeybees, bumblebees actually form annual colonies. So these colonies are typically made up of less than 200 individual bees, but can be up to 1,000. And they forage much closer to the nest than honeybees do. It does depend on the species on how far they'll fly, but it's typically not more than half a mile, and up to a mile. There's some differences in the literature in this, but the interesting thing is that because they're annual colonies, only the new queens or gynes will actually overwinter. So the workers are produced first, and then the males are produced later in the season by the queen. And then shortly after the males are produced, the gynes are produced. And the gynes are going to be the new queens that overwinter in the soil or in like underneath leaf litter, and then they emerge in the spring to start the process all over again. And because of these flight patterns, the early emerging queens and then the queens that will be preparing to overwinter, early and late blooming plants are particularly important to include in your garden if you're looking specifically to benefit bumblebees. So there's ground nesting bees. We're getting into the nesting habits. So about 70% of our native bees are solitary ground nesters, and they dig in bare or sparsely vegetated soil. And depending on the species, they can prefer flat ground to vertical banks, or they can also have different nest configurations. So they can have short, simple tunnels, or they can have complex branching structures. So this is my obligatory note about the importance of prescribed fire in managing our natural areas. Fire is kind of nature's cleanup crew, and this provides that bare soil component that's really important for ground nesting bees. So maybe not burn your garden, but just make sure that you are aware of the benefits of prescribed fire and how necessary it is in managing these natural areas. So we also have wooden tunnel nesting bees.
Leslie, can I just ask you a quick question? Leslie, can I ask you a quick question before you leave the ground nesting bees? You already told us that everybody in a bumblebee nest dies except for the brand new queens, the gynes, who live on to the next year. How long do ground nesting bees live? Do they pretty much only survive for a year as well? Or,
yes.
Okay.
Yes, they typically, so the female nests, the females that provision the nest, they kind of just have like those one babies. And as far as I'm aware, I'm sure that there's exceptions to the rule, that maybe the bees do overwinter as well, but I assume that the adults die at the end. I'm sure that I'll have Coleman Little, I'll ask him after the fact and he'll say, well, there's this one species. So there's always exceptions to the rule, but I think that that's the general rule of thumb for our natives.
Okay, and we also have one question in the chat, which is relevant. I have lots of holes in the dirt in my yard. Can I distinguish between bees and wasps from the holes?
So it's difficult, but if you wanted to set up a lawn chair, you can kind of hang out and see. Wasps, because they're so like ground wasps, the ones that sting you, they have a lot of nest activity. So you'll see a lot of individuals going in and out of the nest. Solitary bees, it's just that one individual. So they have to visit thousands of flowers so that they can, on a single trip, so that they can go back to the nest and kind of start building their little bee bread or that pollen ball that they lay their egg on. So I would kind of err on the side of that. There's also the potential that it's not a bee or a wasp nest at all. It could be another insect.
Thank you.
Ready to continue? Okay, so we have wooden tunnel nesting bees. This makes up the other 30% of our native bees. Sometimes they're called stem nesting bees, and many tunnel nesting species actually use abandoned beetle burrows in standing dead trees or limbs. So it's kind of better to leave that garden messy. And some of them actually chew out the pith, which is kind of like if you break a plant stem in half, if there's kind of that styrofoamy looking stuff in the center, that's pith. And they can use plants like elderberry, blackberry, Joe Pye weed, some of our coneflower species, to use those stems for it. So I can't talk about those stem nesting bees without people asking me about bee houses. So I wanted to address that during the presentation. I want you to use caution when purchasing mass-produced bee houses. And the reason why is because most of them don't have the proper dimensions to actually benefit our native bees. Any hole that's larger than about 5/8 of an inch is probably too large for our native bees to use. They also sometimes are glued together, so they're not able to be properly sanitized. Imagine staying in a hotel that has never, ever seen housekeeping. It's just asking for bacteria and parasites and disease to spread. And remember, most of these bees are solitary, so they're used to being spread out across the landscape. They're not used to being clustered so tightly together. So just be cautious. But if you wanted to have a bee house, an artificial house for these bees so that you can kind of observe and see how they're using your garden. I really recommend using the Xerces Society. Has some great handouts on their website. I'll talk about them more throughout the presentation. But they do have one called Tunnel Nests for Native Bees, which is the brown handout, and then Nests for Native Bees, which is the green handout. Of these, I like the brown handout because it does talk about the need to maintain these houses and how to properly sanitize them. So I really recommend you check out those if you're interested in bee houses. And remember, the key messaging for all of these artificial nest sites always come back to planting Arkansas native plants so that we can create natural habitat that these bees would have in the wild. So how we would do that is, say you had some coneflowers and you left their seed heads to stand over the winter. And this is kind of like nature's bird feeder. I'm sure you'll see some goldfinches or something pecking at the seeds and eating. So next spring, you'll cut those seed heads off after the birds are done eating them, and you keep them about 8 to 28 inches in height, and those bees will find them and they'll start using them to kind of section off their babies into their own little room. And in the summer, that native plant will resprout and it'll cover the stubble so you won't even really notice it's there. Then the next winter, you let the whole process start all over again, and in the spring, the new bees will emerge. The native bee populations are in decline, and there's not much that are known about our native bee species, mainly because, as I mentioned before, their biology, it makes it very difficult to study them. It's a single tiny bee that nests in the ground. So it's very difficult to monitor their populations and distributions across the state. We're working on it, and there are sampling techniques, but still there's a lot that's unknown. And 40% of our pollinator species are at risk of extinction. So it's very concerning that we don't really even know how we can better help the species. And I'm going to pick on the bumblebee because they're large and well studied, and they're social nesting. They have those colonies, so they're easier to study. And again, this is from Dr. Rich Hatfield with the Xerces Society. In North America, a quarter of our bumblebee species are in a threatened or near threatened category. So if we're using bumblebees as kind of the litmus test, the canary in the coal mine for our native bees, we're in big trouble. So native bees are important because they provide, ecosystem services. They provide essential pollination that maintains 80% of our native plant species. I've also seen the literature is a little confusing there, but they're very important. They can improve the yield of 3/4 of our crops, and they provide billions of dollars in pollination services annually. And as much as honeybees are used to pollinate our crops, they're not necessarily the most efficient or best pollinators for all crops and native plants, mainly because honeybees are not capable of buzz pollination, but there is power in numbers. So just keep that in mind. So very quickly, so we can get to the good stuff, what is Arkansas doing for pollinator conservation? In 2015, the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership was formed. It's a group of different federal and state agencies, nonprofits, academia, private citizens, utility organizations that are all working together towards the goals that are outlined in the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Conservation Plan. And this plan was finalized in 2018, and it focuses on habitat conservation, enhancement, and restoration, research and monitoring, and outreach and education. And if you're interested in reading more about how this plan focuses specifically on monarch butterflies and our native bees, you can check it out on our website, arkansasmonarchs.org. So the plan that I just talked about specifically mentions monarch and pollinator habitat. So this means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So I want to define it for you tonight. When I say monarch and pollinator habitat, I'm talking about a high diversity of blooming native species that bloom throughout the entire growing season so that there's a constant supply of nectar and pollen for our bees and butterflies. We want to make sure that we're incorporating a diversity of flower sizes, shapes, and structures so that we can benefit those generalist pollinators as well as those specialist pollinators. We want to make sure to include those native milkweed species. Not only do our native bees love them, but they are also essential to the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. And remember, when we talk about monarch and pollinator habitat, we're managing it to benefit all pollinators. So our honeybees, our native bees, all of those flies and wasps, and all other wildlife species. So turkey, bobwhite quail, deer can all benefit from monarch and pollinator habitat. So how can you help? You can create habitat by planting Arkansas native plants. And when you're doing that, I want you to work with what you've got. Make sure that you identify those existing light, soil, and water conditions that you have in your yard or wherever you want to create habitat, because the more research and time that you spend on the front end selecting plants, the less headache and heartache you'll have later, because you want to make sure that you're picking the right plants for the right place. Remember, it was, there was something growing here before people were in Arkansas. So plants covered the landscape. So you want to make sure that you're picking the plants that historically would have been there. And remember, Arkansas native plants are adapted to the soil and water conditions, how much rainfall we get. So we can definitely pick plants for the right space. And you can always start small. You can always go big later. And really, the first step is deciding how formal you want your garden to be. Maybe you want a really formal garden that's mulched, maybe has some landscape barrier fabric, which I don't necessarily recommend if you want to benefit the soil nesting bees. You can have kind of a hybrid where there's swaths of color and everything looks kind of messy, but very organized. Or you could have something that's very messy. Sometimes this is called a pocket prairie. You can also use container gardens. It is possible with natives. You just need to make sure that you're mindful of watering. Some of our natives don't like having wet feet. They're adapted to those really dry conditions. So you can definitely love them to death. And you have to remember that because they're above ground, soils are really great insulator. So you have to make sure that your pots don't get too cold in the winter. Usually this is just as simple as putting them close to the house on the south side, or maybe even pulling them in a garage and periodically watering them. Also, squirrels are a consideration, and I've had ants in mine. And typically plants that are grown in containers are smaller than they would be naturally because they have stunted root systems, and also they have shorter bloom periods. But it is possible, and I have native plants in pots, and I have had hummingbirds and all kinds of insects. There's other resources online that you can check out if you want. If you can't write that fast, check out the recording, and there's a lot of great articles out there. Just make sure that the species that are recommended in here, they were resources developed in other states. So some of the recommendations might not actually be native to Arkansas. So personally, in terracotta pots, I was renting my home and I wanted native plants. So I've successfully grown butterfly milkweed, world milkweed, green antelope, corn, swamp, common, and tall green milkweed in terracotta pots. I've also been successful with prairie blazing star, rattlesnake master, and black-eyed Susan in terracotta pots. But hopefully my site will be ready this year and I'll be able to plant. So very quickly, bee size, it's kind of a complete 180, but bee size correlates with foraging range. And I stole this slide from Coleman Little, so he gets all the credit. But basically the distance between the wings is directly correlates to how far these bees can forage away from their nests. So the main take-home message for you here is that foraging habitat needs to be close to the nesting habitat if you really want to benefit our native bees. So what do I plant? What do you want to plant in your yard? You want to maximize the diversity for your area. So maybe you're working with a whole yard. Maybe you're just starting with one bed. Start with the rule of 3. And that means that you're going to pick 3 species that bloom in each season during the growing period. So we want 3 that bloom in the spring, 3 that bloom in the summer, and 3 that bloom in the fall. And remember, the end goal is to provide a succession of blooms to ensure that our native bees have a constant supply of nectar and pollen. And really, our native bees are some of the earliest to emerge in the spring, and some of the last to go to sleep in the fall, if you will. So make sure that you're paying particular attention to those very early spring blooming plants and the late fall blooming plants. And as a general rule of thumb, remember more plant diversity, the greater bee diversity that we'll have. Go ahead, Lynn.
Thank you. Sorry to
You're fine.
on you there. I'd just like to say that in Arkansas, in particular, our blooming season is incredibly long. I have seen bumblebees out in February on my holly trees. I have Burford hollies, and they start to bloom in February some years, and they are bee magnets. And last year, we didn't have our first hard frost until December. So things in my yard were blooming. My Turk's caps were blooming into December. The hummingbirds were long gone, but the Turk's caps were still blooming. So it's more of a challenge for us here in Arkansas, the rule of 3, because there are very few plants that have a really long blooming period. So I almost think that, and what I have found is that I'm really talking about more than 3 for each season. I'm trying to get blooms going from late February to early December. And that is a challenge. It is certainly doable, but it is a challenge. So thank you.
Yes, 100%. Lynn is absolutely right. I actually don't tell people the rule of 3 anymore, because typically that's what only sticks in people's mind. Once they have their 9 species, they're like, oh, I'm done. I'm saving the pollinators, which, it's better than no native plants at all. But I mean, think of how long summer is. Some of our native plants that I'll recommend, sometimes they only bloom for like 3 weeks in early June, but they're counted as a summer blooming plant. So remember, as you're working on, being more aware of what plants you're planting in your garden, just kind of pay attention and pretend that you're a bee. If you were hungry, would there be anything to eat in your yard? So again, the more plant diversity, the greater bee diversity you can support. And I have a really cool graphic that we'll look at in just a moment that kind of shows these plant pollinator interactions. Sometimes it's recommended that you plant multiple plants clustered tightly together. Well, clustered together, not tightly together. So you can kind of plant in these berms or swaths. It's more aesthetically pleasing to the neighbors if you're planting in your front yard and that's something that you're concerned about. And it also makes it easier for the pollinators to find, and it takes them less energy to pollinate those flowers, takes less energy for them to get what they need, as opposed if they're, flying between single plants that are further away. You want to try and aim for a minimum of 70%, like 70% of your landscape is made of native plants, but more is better. Non-natives can provide some benefit, but just because it blooms doesn't mean it's good for bees. Make sure that you know your natives, and just because you've seen a plant in Arkansas doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually native to Arkansas. Think of the wisteria that we see blooming all on the roadsides. We do have a native wisteria, or even Queen Anne's lace. A lot of people think Queen Anne's lace is a native plant. It's not native. So just kind of be aware, and please don't plant invasive species. If you want to keep your grandmother's peonies in your yard because they have an emotional value to you, go for it. It's your yard. Plant what you want, but please, please, please don't plant invasive species that can escape your yard and harm our natural areas. Landscapes with less than 70% native vegetation were called food deserts or habitat sinks by some recent researchers who work with Doug Tallamy, and I'll talk about him a little bit later. And remember, if you want to plant for pollinators, please plant native plants. So this is that very intimidating graph that I was talking about, but we're going to break it down together. So on the left-hand side of these graphs are the plants, and on the right-hand side, we have the bee species. And the lower on the list it's the plants, the less visited by pollinators it was. And towards the top of the list, the more species visited that particular plant. And the same for the right. So the lower the bee species are on the list, the less species of flowers it visited. And the higher up on the list it is, the more flowers it visited. So you can kind of almost think of it like towards the top, we're looking more at our generalist pollinators that aren't very picky eaters. And towards the bottom, we have those single lines that are coming off of single bees. So you can really see the variation in all of these things. So again, as a general rule of thumb, the more plants that you put on the landscape, the more bees that you'll be able to support, because we want to make sure that we're taking care of those specialist bees in addition to our generalist bees, even if they are the ones that you recognize, like our bumblebees. So very quickly, I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. Don't get frustrated if you're trying to write them down. But here are some examples of some spring, summer, and fall bloomers that you can plant to benefit bees in your yard. So some of our early spring bloomers are trees and shrubs, actually. So Chickasaw plum is one, foxglove beard tongue is another, golden alexanders is actually a native host plant for some of our swallowtail caterpillars. So if you're tired of them eating your dill and fennel, you should definitely plant golden alexanders in your yard. Landsleaf coreopsis, New Jersey tea, prairie willow, redbuds. Redbuds are on the photo on the right, you see these beautiful pink blossoms, and actually our leafcutter bees kind of cut out these perfect little circles in the redbud leaves, and that's what they line. They kind of wallpaper their babies' rooms with the cutout circles from these redbud leaves. So it's really lovely. So you're benefiting their nesting sites as well as their nectar and pollen. But there's also robin's plantain and round leaf ground stencil, which is a great ground cover. We also have those summer bloomers. These are a lot easier to find, but make sure that you're incorporating those spring and fall bloomers. Black-eyed Susans are great. Culver's root, pale purple coneflower is one of my favorites, but they do bloom earlier in the summer for us. Purple prairie clover and prairie blazing stars are some of my other favorites. Compass plant is a great pollinator plant, but they do get very, very tall. Slender mountain mint is a very good species. It's on the right bottom photo, but like with many of our other mint species, it can kind of spread aggressively. So if that's not what you're looking for that plant to do in your garden, you may not want to plant it. We also have wild bergamot, or bee balm, as some people know it. Gray-headed coneflower is the flower on the upper right, and that's a longhorn bee that's using it. And then we also have prairie coreopsis. These are some of our fall bloomers. Another blazing star species, asters, blue lobelia, Drummond's aster, rough blazing star. Pollinators really love those goldenrod species and aster species. So make sure that you research these different species so that you know what to expect if you plant them in your yard. So specifically, if you want to benefit bumblebees, some of these species are overlap, but I watched Heather Holmes' The Bombus Among Us Bumblebee Basics webinar that was hosted by Wild Ones. That's another webinar that I highly recommend. Heather Holmes is amazing. But she specifically listed some native perennials that provide pollen. These are some of those in the genera that she recommended that are also native to Arkansas. So white wild indigo, partridge pea, that purple prairie clover again, shrubby St. John's wort, Ohio spiderwort, and some of those are actually nectarless plants. So these pollen producing plants can be very beneficial to queens specifically when they freshly emerge from overwintering. We also have some native perennials that provide nectar for workers, bee balm again, beard tongue species, mountain mints, and vervains. And then we also have native perennials that provide nectar for males. And remember, those are produced later than the females. So we have these bee balm species, native milkweeds that pollinators love, coneflowers, Joe Pye weed that's also used for stem nesting bees, and those goldenrod and aster species as well.
Leslie,
sources for queen. Yeah.
Could I just say one thing? Sorry.
No, you're fine. Do you want me to go back a slide?
No, this slide is great. One thing to remember when you're looking for plants and planning what to plant in your garden, you may be like some people and have an open sunny spot that gets full sun. You may be like me and have a wooded area that only gets partial sun. There are lots of plants with multiple species in one genus. like goldenrod and aster I'm thinking of, but there's many, many more. And some grow great in the woods, others grow great in the prairies. So if you find a plant like a goldenrod here on this list, and you discover that it won't grow well under your conditions, there's probably going to be a goldenrod or more than one that does. So, just, do a little more research and you'll find a plant that fits for you.
100%. I'll use milkweeds as an example. So there's 21 native milkweed species in Arkansas, and most of them are found in prairies. Most of them do like full sun, but we do have some native milkweed species that can tolerate shade. Take, for example, red ring milkweed or world milkweed or purple milkweed. They actually need some shade. I have actually accidentally killed my milkweed because I gave it a little bit too much sun. I put it, see, I told you, right plant, right place. But thank you for adding that. So there's other nectar sources for queen bumblebees, specifically those gynes that are about to overwinter. So blue star, excuse me, these are spring blooming plants. So Chickasaw plum, blue star, Dutchman's breeches, Shawnee salad, and bladdernut are early blooming plants that can be particularly beneficial to queen bumblebees. And just because a plant isn't on this list doesn't mean that bumblebees will use it. These are just some small examples of, what you could plant if that's what you were interested in. So these are the native perennials that provide nectar for the gynes. Those are the queens that are about to overwinter. So Joe Pye weed, the blazing star species, which is Liatris, bee balm, bergamot, again, those goldenrod and vervain species. So these are kind of these powerhouse plants that provide a lot of benefit. So we've talked a lot about nectar plants, but don't forget about their habitat needs. Bees need more than just flowers. So we highly recommend that you leave the leaves instead of bagging them up and sending them on their way. They can be used as a natural mulch. So they provide that weed control and moisture retention that a lot of people, use bark for. And in the leaves, we actually may have caterpillars or pupae of Lepidoptera species. So those are the butterflies and moths that may be in the leaves that are overwintering so that they can become an adult later, in the spring. So we could be getting rid of those very pretty butterflies. And reconsider how much you mulch. Bare ground is very important for native bees. You can use thinner layers of mulch so that they can get through it, or you can kind of reverse it. You can mulch, like heavily mulch your walking areas, and then underneath the plants, instead of mulching around them, you could leave that bare and plant more plants so that they kind of self mulch, if you will. And I really recommend, I should have opened with this, but the picture on the right is actually a screenshot of the cover of a great handout, again, by the Xerces Society. It's called Nesting and Overwintering Habitat for Pollinators and Other Beneficial Insects. It is a fantastic resource. I highly, highly recommend that everyone that's participating in this webinar check it out. They also talk about planting a log, so incorporating that dead wood component and leaving the stubble, again, for those stem nesting bees or tunnel nesting bees. And really, the other thing to consider, kind of back to that graphic that I brought up earlier, you want to make sure that you postpone garden cleanup until temperatures are consistently above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. We want to make sure that since you left the standing stubble all winter, that we don't get rid of those baby bees before they have a chance to emerge. Another thing that I get asked a lot, is, what if the city complains, or what if my neighbors complain about the yards? I highly recommend not necessarily that you have to certify your garden, but that you define the edges of the space if you're doing it in your front yard, so that you can make your plantings look intentional. Or even if you wanted to have a messy pollinator garden in your yard, like a pocket prairie, make sure that you have like a mowed strip kind of around the edge so that people know that it's very intentional, it's cultivated, and that you're planting for pollinators. Also, don't underestimate the power of a sign and educating folks as to why you're doing what you're doing, why you're growing for pollinators. So if you wanted to certify your garden, there are some different certification programs, and I left off the most important one, but if you wanted to go back and watch my Monarch webinar, I have it in there. We have certified wildlife habitat that's from National Wildlife Federation and the Arkansas Wildlife Federation. We have the Monarch Way Station program that's through Monarch Watch, that also benefits the bees. And then there's the Bird Friendly Yard program that's through the Arkansas Audubon Society. And we also have something called Arkansas Wild Spaces. And they actually provide free consultations for people who are interested in creating native gardens in their yard. It's done through Central Arkansas Master Naturalists. And Lynn, if you wouldn't mind dropping the link to that website for the viewers, I would greatly appreciate it. They cover several counties in Central Arkansas, and I apologize for not including them on this slide. They are a great asset to those that live in Central Arkansas. And if you are interested specifically in signs, the Monarch Joint Venture and the Xerces Society also have signs available for purchase on their website. So make sure that you're also setting your expectations for your native garden. Natives have very extensive root systems, so sometimes they take a while to grow. It may not look like much, but we have a saying when it comes to native plants. In the first year, they sleep. So in the second year, they creep. And in the third year, they leap. So just remember, patience is key. And it's kind of like an iceberg. There's a lot going on below the surface. There's a lot going on with their root systems before they can really show up above ground and start blooming and filling in that space. So where to get plants? That's another question we get asked a lot. I have a native plant vendor list that I am hoping to post on the website by the end of October. If you want, you can email me. I'd be happy to send it to you. And just please don't steal plants from roadsides or from natural areas where you may find them. Like I said, native plants have very extensive root systems. So if you dig them up, you could kill them. So that would be removing a plant from the wild and also removing it for pollinators for the future. There are several recurring native plant sales in Central Arkansas. One just is finishing up now. It's the semi-annual Audubon Arkansas sale. You can order in advance and drive through and pick up. Check out Audubon Arkansas's Facebook page for details on that. And if you missed it this year, that's okay. You can start planning and get ready for ordering plants in the spring. And Central Arkansas Master Naturalists and Partners for Pinnacle also do a plant sale. It's in March at the Pinnacle Greenhouse, and you can check their Facebook pages for the dates. There are also some in-state native plant nurseries. Grand Prairie Nursery sells at Hillcrest Farmers Market. There's Pine Ridge Gardens, which is the only brick and mortar native plant vendor in the state. There's also Native Sun Nursery that's located in Whitehall. Grand Designs that's in Little Rock. It's by appointment only, but they also offer landscaping services. And there's a bunch of other nurseries in Northwest Arkansas if you're tuning in from there. If you wanted to get plant material shipped to you, there are some out-of-state native plant nurseries. Prairie Moon is a very popular one, as is Missouri Wildflowers Nursery. There's also a Garden for Wildlife by National Wildlife Federation. They have different pollinator packs that you can do, and Bower and Branch, they have some straight species that I'll talk a little bit about later, but we're almost at time, so I better get cooking. Another great thing is the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native website has a resource guide on their website, so you can go through and see different individual vendors. And the only consideration that you need to do when you're buying out of state is ecotypes are very important. Take it, for example, Black-Eyed Susan. Black-Eyed Susan is also native in Minnesota. Minnesota is a bit different than Arkansas, so if the original parent plant was from Minnesota, if it's adapted to Minnesota conditions, it may not do very well in Arkansas, even if it's also a species that's native here. You can also purchase single species seed packets if you want to propagate your own native plants. I do have a handout on using a milk jug propagation method, and there's these nurseries that you can check back and write down later. And if you're working on large scale projects that you want to purchase a large quantity of a seed mix for a larger area, make sure that you're working with one of your local biologists. They provide free technical assistance, and they can provide you the seed mix that's appropriate for your area. We have ecoregion seed mixes in Arkansas, and you can think of these as recipe cards. So the biologist will give you a recipe card and then also a vendor list, and you'll contact each vendor and see what they'll quote you for the different size project that you have. So a quick note on nativars and cultivars. A nativar is a cultivar of a native species, and they're frequently called nativars. And they can be identified from their plant tag. Typically, it has a descriptive name in addition to their common or scientific name on there. Something that we refer to as a straight species. These are the species that are found in nature and it hasn't been cultivated for a particular feature. Recent research on nutritional value and pollinator preference is still ongoing. And the big answer is it depends. It varies widely between cultivars and nativars, and not all cultivars and nativars are created equal. Some of them may not even produce nectar and pollen at all. So the white flower, so all of these are technically purple cone flower. So the one on the upper left-hand corner is a purple cone flower. The one to the right of that, the white one, because the colors changed, we talked about bees being able to see in UV light. They don't see that plant as well, so it's probably not providing as much of a benefit to pollinators as you'd probably like. The bottom right, not very much has changed according to the Xerces website, other than there's more flowers on that. I don't know specifically about the protein content of the pollen or the nectar. And the bottom left is actually a double petaled purple cone flower. So even though that's very interesting to look at, it might as well be a plastic food on Thanksgiving for pollinators. There is no nectar in pollen. It's a sterile variety. So while it may be pretty, are you going to plant for yourself or do you want to plant for bees? So consider that when you're planting and make sure that you're aware. And this is just a photo that I took. The one on the left and the one in the middle is the same plant tag, but just be aware that when you're reading plant tags, if you see a name like frankly scarlet in quotations, you can pretty much identify which one is a cultivar and which one is a straight native species. So we talked about creating habitat as a way to help. Another way that you can help is help with native bee monitoring. If you're not on it already, I highly recommend that you join this thing called iNaturalist. It's a free app and it's also a website. You can upload photos of native bees that you see in your yard, and that information is directly pulled into 2 different community science projects. So if you want to learn more about how you can help us monitor the bees in Arkansas, you can visit our website. There are a few different resources on arkansasmonarchs.org. There's a maintenance guide, there's a recommended planting list. I want to make sure that everyone is aware of pollinator and wildflower mixes. Kind of approach those with caution. Just because something says that it's going to be beneficial to pollinators or that it's a wildflower doesn't mean that they're going to have native species. So always make sure that the species you're planting are native to Arkansas at the very least, and preferably to your ecoregion. So I use a tool called BoneApp. I have a user guide if you're interested in learning how to use that. The Ladybird Johnson Wildflower Center is also a very useful tool that's very user-friendly, and it does tell you if it's native to the state. BoneApp actually tells you if it's native to the county that you're in. The USDA Plants database is also an excellent tool, and if you're very interested, there is the Atlas of Vascular Plants of Arkansas, and you can just Google that title and it's available for free download. These are some of the handouts that are newly created. They're not on our website yet, but I hope to have them posted by the end of October. There are landscape plans available if you need a little bit of inspiration. I highly recommend the Missouri Prairie Foundation's Grow Native website. It's grownative.org. And even though these plans have different names, all of the landscape plans will benefit pollinators because they're using native plants. Because it's a Missouri resource, you do need to double check and make sure that the plants are also native to Arkansas, but it is a great place to start. Heather Holm also has a lot of resources on her website. She is in Minnesota, so Again, you have to check and make sure the species are native to Arkansas, but you can find everything from wasp fact sheets to native plant posters at pollinatorsnativeplants.com. Here are some recommended reads. I think Central Arkansas Library has copies of all of these. I love the Bees in Your Backyard book. It's highly informative. It's beautiful pictures. And my husband, who is not a biologist, absolutely loves it. And I know for those of you that are joining us again, and you watched my last month's presentation, bear with me. I really recommend, if this is the first year ever hearing about native plants and pollinators, and I just gave you a whole bunch of new information, please read the work of Dr. Doug Talmy. The book on the left, Bringing Nature Home, is his older book. Nature's Best Hope is his newest book. And I'll leave you with a quote. Doug Talmy in his latest book says, "If half of American lawns were converted to native plants, we would create the equivalent of a 20 million acre national park. That is 9 times the size of Yellowstone and 100 times the size of Shenandoah National Park." So really, conservation is in your hands. You can make a difference in your own yard. And if you're a landowner interested in receiving free technical assistance or learning more about cost share programs, you can contact your local biologist or email me. These are for larger restoration projects, but the Quail Forever Farm Bill biologists help landowners utilize federal and state cost share programs that can be used to create high quality habitat for monarchs and pollinators. They do provide free technical assistance and right management plans. And Arkansas Game and Fish private lands biologists also help navigate state cost share programs and provide plans. So as the parting information, I know I gave you guys a lot. 1, plant a diversity of Arkansas native plants to guarantee a constant supply of nectar and pollen from March through November, or even earlier and later if possible. Provide bee habitat. Remember, they require foraging, nesting, and overwintering habitat. And don't spray insecticides, because even though we're trying to kill some garden pests, it will kill pollinators in addition to the target species. So they're non-discriminatory. And with that, I end. And I'm so sorry I did not leave more time for questions, but I'm happy to answer any that are in the chat box.
Well, actually, I think you did such a good job that we really only have 2 questions. So okay. Let me start with the first one, which I think will be a shorter answer, and that is and you kind of already answered it, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit just for a minute or so. What do you think about spraying for mosquitoes? Is it harmful?
I think that it has what?
Maybe how is it not harmful? No, go ahead.
I know I think that, it's not good. I'll just leave it at that. It's not good. If you can get on a spray list, that would be great. It's really unfortunate because I think that if we, created better habitat for mosquitoes' natural predators like bats and other, like amphibians and whatnot, other things that prey on mosquitoes, I think that would create, that would control the mosquito population far better than any spraying. And I know that, mosquitoes can be a vector for illnesses and diseases. But if you can try and shield your pollinator planting from maybe drift from the mosquito flogger, but there's only so much that we can do. And if you're worried about mosquitoes on your property, instead of maybe using like a yard fogger, you can use Mosquito Dunks. Just make sure that if whatever body of water you're plopping that in has a screen, or at least a way for animals to get out if they happen to fall in. There's a lot of research. Well, there's a lot of information out there for making your own kind of mosquito trap. You don't have to go out and do that, but if that's a primary concern of yours, you can do that. And the Mosquito Dunks are a good way to do it because it targets the larva.
Great, thank you. And we have 2 minutes left. And the second question is, where can we find a comprehensive list of natives and when they bloom? And in chat, I already posted a link to that little Game and Fish brochure about pollinators pollinator plants. So they've got the link to that, but what else would you recommend?
So please send me an email. I have this monster of a spreadsheet. Lynn has seen it. She can attest to how much information's on it. It's not 100% guaranteed because it was created. I've already seen like a few minor errors, and it really depends on, well, minor errors in quotations. It really depends on the part of the state you're in. It is a statewide list of native plants that benefit pollinators, and it does have their bloom period. But think of the difference between South Arkansas and up north in the Ozarks. I mean, if you drive across the state, you can, see the succession of blooms. Something that's done blooming in Southern Arkansas may bloom a month later in Northern Arkansas. So in Central Arkansas, it's a little different. But if you're interested in getting a comprehensive list of bloom periods, please shoot me an email. That information's also on the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. That's based in Texas. So again, it might be a little bit off from Arkansas. The Missouri Botanical Garden also has some great information on bloom periods. But again, just shoot me an email and I'd be happy to send you that PDF. And I'm sure Lynn knows the author, Arkansas Wildflowers. I don't think I have it on there, but it is on a handout that I have for recommended reads. It's by Kurtz.
Kurtz. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's in print anymore. Or there's two of them. One is in print. The more comprehensive one is no longer in print, but Theo Wetzel and a few others are working on a new book about wildflowers, which will be fantastic when it comes out.
Yes, there's two. The first one that's out of print is by Carl Hunter. That's not going to do you any good. If you Google Arkansas wildflowers, maybe Lynn, you'll have enough time to type it in the chat. But it has a lily on the cover. It's green and it's a bright orange flower.
We are a little bit over time, so thanks everyone. I'm seeing Gail is saying she'll have to watch again because there's so much good information. That's what we want. We want you to watch us again. So thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Cals, for sponsoring this series this year. And thanks to all of our people in the audience. We're glad that you found this useful. That is our hope. So good night, everybody. Thanks so much.